idea behind all this is, let's see, poetry in the void, sometimes, especially in translation, doesn't always make much complete sense, or it can lose a lot of its power and potential and be, turned into something a bit simpler. And so what we have been trying to do, and these famous poems we were asked to translate, was to put in dialogue, what the poem is offering to Mexican audiences or readers, and what translators can manage to stretch or include in what we are doing. And we are also a bit interested in, after translation, what happens with publishing, for example, with the next steps, and also what happens in Canada with publishing and all these this work being taught in universities, etc. So yeah, our plan is that this is just a starting point, and that hopefully in Mexico, in some moment, we'll be able to get together and do this in greater detail.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah, because we've read we've been working on the Canadian literature in our college, in our facultad, and increasingly we've been reading not just very sort of traditional mainstream authors, but we've opened up to, for example, poetry written by Indigenous women, and this has had enormous meaning for us here, sometimes much more than some of the more mainstream authors. So yes, we've read your work. Our students have written about your poems, and now we chose hummingbirds for this. So once again, thank you for saying yes. And what I'd just briefly like to mention is that my colleague Ariadna is going to coordinate the chat with there were 4 translators working on your text, and they've kept some sort of register of their different doubts or suggestions, which they wanted to share with you today. So Ariadna, please carry on, and we're all here listening with interest.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Hi, Kateri. It's a pleasure to meet you. And well, just because this is recorded and this will be afterwards shown to other people, I wish to introduce you and the other participants to our future audience. So Kateri Akiwenzie-Damm is a writer, poet, spoken word performer, libertist and activist from the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, as well as an assistant professor of creative writing, Indigenous literatures and oral traditions at the University of Toronto. She is the founder and managing editor of Kegedonse Press, which was established in 1993 to publish the work of Indigenous creators. Kateri has written 2 books of poetry, was a contributor to the graphic novel anthology This Place, 150 Years Retold, was editor of the award-winning Skins Contemporary Indigenous Writing, and has also released 2 poetry and music CDs. Kateri's work has been published internationally, and she has performed and spoken around the world. Regeneration, the poetry of Kateri Akiwenzie-Damm, a book of collected poems edited by Dallas Hunt, was published this year by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. And well, about our participants, the translators, which I'm proud to say were my students. I wish to introduce Alejandra Espinosa, who's a former undergraduate student and is currently working on her dissertation. And this is her first formal experience with translation. Then Aileen Lopez Ramirez, she's a Zapotec student from Juchitán, Oaxaca, and studies English language and literature at our university. She specialized in translation as part of her studies, and this is her first translation experience outside the classroom as well. Lia Galvan is currently taking her last undergraduate classes and writing her dissertation, and like her colleagues, she specialized in literary translation, and this is her first formal experience. And finally, Yatsibe Paniagua Vera is also an English undergraduate who also specialized in translation and is currently working on her dissertation, and her literary interests are speculative fiction, contemporary poetry, and drama. So I want my fellow translators to ask you, Kateri, some questions about your work, and then you can ask them some other questions about their process and etc. No? So, who would like to start?
One of the first things that got our attention from your poem was your use of the English language. We found that you don't use most of the formal features of it. For example, you don't use capital letters or any punctuation marks. So the first question that we want to ask you is, considering that you write in a multicultural context, do linguistic, syntactic, and phonological aspects from different languages intervene in your poetry?
Okay, Miigwech, thank you for that question. So really, it's an attempt to disrupt those conventions and to assert Indigenous space within poetry. So I resist the kind of authority of the capital I and that perspective. So I have for many years refused to use a capital I in my poetry in particular. Punctuation, similarly, I'm trying to replicate the kinds of sounds and rhythms when I can of the language of my people, and to disrupt notions of those standards and those conventions being somehow elevated in comparison to other uses of language and uses of English, because there are many, many different forms of English, and yet there's some kind of perception that sort of the Queen's English is the ultimate expression of that. I reject that idea. I reject the way that colonizes people's thinking and their forms of poetic, cultural, and self-expression. And so, those aspects of my poetry are really kind of a speaking back, an assertion of a different perspective, of my own coming from the community and the history that I come from.
Yes, we will also like to ask this. Do your poems establish a sort of dialogue between Indigenous and non-Indigenous literatures in Canada? And if so, what is this dialogue like?
Sorry, what was the last part of it?
If so, what is this dialogue like?
Right. I suppose to a certain extent, I mean, for many years, I've asserted that that Indigenous literatures in this land, in our own homelands, we're not a subset of Canadian literature, which is often the way that we've been perceived, but rather Canadian literature doesn't exist without us. We're our own literatures that belong, along with other world literatures, and we have a relationship with the literature that's coming out of Canada, and we're aware of it, and we often speak back to it or dialogue with it. But so I think, that's part of what's happening in my work. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to decenter, I guess, that idea that we always have to be speaking back to the settler society. We always have to be speaking back to colonialism. And it's almost impossible not to. I mean, as soon as you speak out, there's a certain element where that's happening. But on the other hand, I think often when I'm thinking about my audience or the people who would be reading my work, poetry and otherwise, I'm thinking about other Indigenous people. And so foremost in my mind is not really that kind of dialogue. It happens, whether I want it to or not. And I do try to control that to the extent that I'm able. So to enter into dialogue in ways that I control that narrative when I can. It's not always possible, but so much of my work, even as a publisher, we've kind of given up on trying to constantly assert our place amongst Canadian publishers. And so we've really just gone in our own direction and created like Aotearoa, New Zealand and Australia, and tried to cultivate those relationships because if we believe ourselves to be autonomous nations within the Canadian colonial nation state, then part of that is to have relationships with other nations. That's part of nationhood. And so there's an element of just rejecting this idea that we have to always be knocking at the gates, begging to be included. And so we have turned away from that. My publishing company, and often in my own work, I reject that. I turn away from that, and I find allies and places where we can cultivate audiences and have respectful relationship and that elevate the ideas of kinship and other values that are part of my Anishinaabe cultural beliefs and traditions and so on, and that create a more positive way for us to work. Because when we're constantly in opposition to colonialism, there's a kind of negativity that overtakes a lot of what you're doing, that and it's not a fair, it's not equal power dynamics. And so you're always feeling diminished by that relationship. And I don't want to be in that position perpetually. And so I reject it, and I work in other ways to create community and kinship with others.
Well, I think the next question is already answered, but I will say it anyways. It's what's it like working as an Anishinaabe poet in a literary and political context where there are two official Western languages, or what has been your personal experience in that regards?
Yeah, well, when I was younger, I went through the mainstream school system, and the two official languages were then English and French. And Indigenous languages, when I was a child, were not really even spoken about. I heard our language spoken at my grandparents' home and in my community, my home community. But this was, I used to feel like I had two lives. I went to school when I was young in Toronto, and then spent summers and the weekends and holidays and everything on the res with my grandparents and my extended family and community. And they were, in many ways, it felt worlds apart, and there didn't feel like there was much overlap between those two. So I kind of had my one life here and my one life over here, and I tried to navigate through life that way. But, later I came to realize that much of what I've said, that puts you always in a disempowered kind of state a lot of the time, and in a weaker position. And so I've worked, my focus would be more on the reclamation and restoration of Indigenous languages rather than worrying about what's happening with English and French. And, in many ways, I do try to disrupt those conventions. When I can, I try to replace them. So I do try to use Anishinaabe, the language of my people, in my work when I can, but I'm not fluent in the language, because of colonial history and residential school, etc. My mother is not fully fluent. And so as the generations went from my grandfather, who was my grandmother, who his partner, who wasn't as fluent as him, to my mother, who wasn't as fluent as either of them, to me, who wasn't fluent at all, and had to kind of try to reclaim that through courses and my own attempts to surround myself with the language when I can and use what little I have. And so I try to enact that in my poetry and my other work, and in the work of my publishing company to give, to elevate Indigenous languages and focus my energy in that direction rather than, that idea of trying to constantly work against something that, frankly, those doors for most of my life haven't been opened. It's a little bit better now in terms of Indigenous literature is winning all the awards in Canada. Like a lot of our writers have finally, kind of broken through, and there's a lot of attention on Indigenous writing right now. But when I was coming up, there wasn't. We had our books classified in with Canadiana, so books about different cities and provinces and flowers and like you name it. And then there'd be a book of someone's poetry or a collection of short stories stuck on that shelf as well. Because it was Indigenous, we were kind of lumped in with Canadiana. So I think there's there are a few ways that I try to address some of these things, a few strategies that I use in my work, but that's kind of primarily where I've gone over the years, how I started out and where it's kind of led me and my thinking. And I've been fortunate because I've had some really great teachers like Haunani K. Trask, who was a native Hawaiian, a Kanaka Maoli activist and who was really, and a professor at the University of Hawaii, and who really had to do this kind of work, ahead of me, and who I learned a lot from. And, others, Jeanette Armstrong and Lee Miracle, and so many people who've kind of helped to break down those barriers and create pathways for us to follow and to, keep moving forward.
I just wanted to make a quick intervention because this experience between Indigenous languages and official languages is something that we also experience in Mexico. But the main difference here is that we only have one official language, which is Spanish, no? And therefore we don't go, when we're studying translation here, we don't usually go into discussions about, for instance, as it happens in Canada, where we've been told by Canadian friends, like, you write in English in Canada, and if you want to be translated into French, you're translated in France and not in French Canada, no? And these kind of problematics that are experienced in a bilingual context. But what is being left out usually of those discussions is that it's actually a multilingual context, no? Such as what happens here in Mexico. We usually leave that out, and we focus a lot on studying translation from European to European languages instead of doing the same kind of work with our own languages. No, so that's basically one of the reasons why we wanted to ask you these questions related to the issue of translation, because we want to go into these discussions of translation as something that is inherent to your own country and something that is happening inside, and not as this bridge between cultures and languages and countries, no?
Right. I mean, ideally, it would be right, but actually it has the opposite kind of effect, where it's another way of leaving people out of those kinds of discussions to power kind of thing. So when people mainly speak about translation and for many years, the funding that was available and so on, it really was just thinking about translating from primarily English to French, but also French to English to a lesser extent. And that was, really the extent of the dialogue around there without considering the impacts of that on the disruptions to Indigenous languages and the decline in Indigenous languages in conjunction with all of the other policies and colonial practices that have led to the diminishment of the number of speakers of our languages. And there are many. But I think translation now, there's more support, there's more acknowledgement of the need for translation into Indigenous languages. There's more funding available to support that. But it's become, because of the passage of time and the fewer number of speakers, then it has added to the complexity of actually doing that work. Because you need to find translators and you need to find people who can review the translations and make, especially when you're working in the literary arts, it's a little bit different than other types of translation. You need people who are extremely fluent in both languages and can understand some of the connotations of words rather than merely the denotations of words. And so it's a challenge. And for many of our languages, there are really so few speakers that there are all sorts of other considerations and complexities around that in terms of, well, what's going to be done with it? Where will it go? Who's going to be using it? Ideally, we think it's for our community members, but in reality, sometimes it's academics who are using these materials. And so they have limited scope, especially given the number of languages and the number of languages that have very few speakers. But even in a language like mine, in Anishinaabe, which has one of the largest numbers of speakers in North America, in terms of Indigenous languages, there are all sorts of complexities that have had to be worked through because there are so many regional variations and dialects and idioms and ways of using the language and speaking the language that it's complicated things, and it's made efforts to reclaim the language. It's almost forced us to fall into some things that maybe we wouldn't have chosen in the past. So, for example, when the Anishinaabe language is taught, they've tried to standardize it. So the most number of people can be taught. And so, somebody who's trained can teach in different regions and teach different people. But what that does is all of those beautiful variations in the language that are connected to different regions and the land and the experience of people within their own territories, that starts to fade away, which is a huge loss that, there've been a lot of debates about, but it's, we have gotten into a situation where we have to make choices that are very, very difficult choices like that, even when it comes to translation. How do we translate stories or poems, and if we move away from that kind of standardized Anishinaabe, for example, what are the implications of that? And will up and coming speakers of the language and children who are learning the language, will they be able to understand it, or will it be an impediment to them using those materials? And, so that it becomes very complex in ways that the system intended, I'm sure. The longer they could delay restoration, investing in the restoration and reclamation of Indigenous languages, the less likely there would be success in actually retaining and bringing those languages forward, because the fluency rates are declining nonetheless. So, I only speak and know a bit of Anishinaabe. I put my children into school in my community, and even in our own schools, they were only getting, I think, 20 minutes of the language a day. And this is the reality that we face in trying to reclaim our languages and trying to use it, and the kinds of questions that are raised when we think about how do we do translations, and who are they for, and what purpose will they serve, and how does this fit with our ideas about our nationhood and sovereignty, and all of those bigger questions that language are a part of. So I don't know if that answers your question a little bit more specifically, but those are the kinds of issues that we're contending with. And my context is, like I said, a language that is one of the most widely spoken. There are languages that there are only, one or two or a handful of speakers remaining. And so they're in a different position of just trying to record the language and document the language in the hopes of being able to revive it. But we all know that while that's necessary and has to be done, it means the language also changes. When you're learning it from the page and not the elder, the parent, the community, it's different. There's something, that you can't capture on the page about how the knowledge that's infused in the language is passed down, because they're often embedded with story and teachings and all sorts of other things that are behind those, the linguistics and the way that the language works and is put together. So a lot of really sad and tremendous impacts from colonialism and the purposeful intent to stop us from speaking our languages and to make that part of our culture die.
Okay, so the next question, I think it's very related to what you just have shared with us. And we would like to know if you have had any experiences regarding translation in your publishing house. And if so, maybe if you'd like, you could share some anecdote or something. Because this is clearly a topic we've all in the literary world have discussed about and have very complex discussions regarding all what surrounds translation. So maybe you could share some of that with us.
Right. So yeah, we do have, we're working with an author. Well, he's not an author, he's a storyteller. Isaac Murdoch. He's a storyteller and very well known, fairly young. And he, through a series of circumstances, did learn from elders. He did, he was removed from the school system and he was sent out in the bush to learn from elders, to learn the language, to learn the stories, and he did. And so he's sharing that. You can find him online, but he's working with us. We've published one of his books. It's a collection of stories, Nana Bush stories. Nana Bush is one of the figures in our storytelling and kind of really occupies space in our culture. I guess in the past, people would have said Nana Bush was a trickster type of figure, although that, maybe that terminology, we don't really use that so much anymore. But, this is Nana Bush is a figure who gets into all sorts of shenanigans and does all sorts of things. And people learn from example, Nana Bush's example, but a lot of times they're bad examples. It's more like what not to do. Although sometimes, Nana Bush is very upright and doing wonderful things, but often is in these situations where Nana Bush is making the wrong choices. But so he collected he actually orally told the stories. They were collected, recorded, collected, edited. There was a whole process that we went through with the help of Christy Belcourt, who is somebody who works closely with Isaac and who is a very well-known visual artist. And Isaac also is a visual artist. So they worked on the manuscript together to a certain extent. And then he had a team of translators working on the stories. And it was a very long and kind of involved process. And it, from what I understand, like, that was before it even reached us, but we were aware of what was happening, and we kind of let them just use the process that they were most happy with, because they also run a culture camp and language retention is part of that. So we took a step back and said, sure, whatever process works for you. It was time consuming, and there were just a lot of fingers in the pie, so to speak. So I think it led to a lot of complexities and things taking a long time. And so we're working on another book with Isaac. We're in the early stages of it. And I think he's hoping to simplify that process to some extent, maybe using fewer translators and having them work more closely together to try to work through the stories. So I'm interested to see how that works and what the final result is and how he feels about the end result. Because one of the outcomes of doing it the other way was it took so long that they didn't even get to translate all of the stories. I think at a certain point they did as much as they could, and then they felt like, we have to get this out there. Like, we can't just keep delaying getting this material out to people, because they wanted it even themselves for the culture camp that they were running. And so I'm hopeful that we're gonna land on the kind of right mix of number of translators and number of people that are involved in reviewing those translations and the kind of back and forth that has to go on. But on the other hand, I think it's been a tremendous experience. He has a lot of followers actually on social media because of his cultural knowledge and his storytelling abilities. And so the book has been more widely distributed than it might otherwise have been. And so it's kind of serving many purposes. So those stories are getting out there. He's being asked to speak a lot in schools and other places where he can talk about the language as well as the stories. And in one of my courses that I've taught at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, we've looked at the stories in his book. And so it's not just my class, but I know other university courses are using those stories as well as part of their curriculum. And so it's had all sorts of impacts, but the beautiful thing about it is that the book has for those stories that are translated, the Anishinaabe and the English are in the same book. There's not a separate Anishinaabe version and a separate English version. So people get it whether they want it or not, whether they can use it or not, but they're always curious about it. Even when you're just, teaching students at university, they kind of want to know, a little, it piques their interest. And I think that's a really positive thing. And it's really positive in terms of when those books land in our own communities with younger people and people who maybe like me are not fluent in the language. So far, it's been an amazing experience and a good one, and one that we're still learning from. We still have questions about how to do it and how to get the most impact. But I think we found the right person. I think the fact that Isaac has such a deep knowledge of story and the land that he comes from and the traditions and cultural teachings, as well as this huge following of people who will who are interested in his work and interested in the book as a result. You know, we got that part right. So we're just refining the process to a certain extent.
Okay, and speaking of your own work, we wanted to ask you to which languages have your poems been translated? And I think that Eileen's question is also related to this topic.
Oh, I should have looked that up, but I don't think it's been translated into too many languages. At one time I did ask Basil Johnson, who was a very well-known, esteemed Anishinaabe writer, teacher of the language, cultural teacher, and so on, who was from my community, whose books we published in my publishing company, some of his books, not all of them, because he was very prolific. And his career started long before my publishing company started. And he's a friend of mine. He lived in my community. He'd stop by and we'd sit out on my deck and chat and drink tea and whatnot. And so there are a few of my poems that he translated into Anishinaabe Mwin. Other than that, I know that over the years, there've been requests come in every once in a while. But usually what happens is it's usually into some sort of European language. And then I don't really hear that much about it afterwards. It's like, if I agree to it, they translate it and maybe send me a copy, but it's very difficult to kind of control that process at a certain level. And the reality is, a lot of times you can't control whether or not they do it in the first place. That's just, unfortunately, that's the reality. So I try to be as involved as possible, but sometimes it's a huge challenge. I mean, especially when you don't know the language. If they're translating it into a language you don't know, then you really have no idea how valid the translation is or how much it captures the various levels of meaning of the poem. But I would say that I haven't really had the experience of very much dialogue around that. Usually, which makes me think that the translations probably are not that good because they're not even contacting me to find out the context for the poems, and I know that I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't know very much about my culture and the teachings that are and language and the histories and everything that are informing my work. So if they don't have that kind of base of knowledge, then I'm not sure I'm thinking they're probably very literal translations of the poetry. So it's kind of, it's really interesting to be asked, and it's interesting to think of the poems having a life in these other places that are a bit disconnected from me and my community. But on the other hand, it's strange to think that they're out there and not really serving the purpose that I intended them for, that they're taking on this other life that is kind of beyond my scope. So it's strange, but I don't have a lot of experience with it, to be honest. Yeah.
Okay, so our next question kind of relates with this answer. I wanted to ask you, what would you expect of the people who carry out the translations of your poems? Like, do you have any specific expectations, things that you would want to see on those translations?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I would like people to enter into some sort of dialogue with me about the poems and to ask some questions as they're translating to see if, because like I said, I think it's very different than translating a memo or, something like that, where the meaning is, can be more literal, but with poetry, there are different layers. And I think it requires a kind of relationship with the poem that I think in most cases I, as the poet, would probably have to intervene in that and provide some of that information, some of that knowledge, some of that background in order for it to start to get beyond the literal translation and to really capture, other elements of the poem. But, it also varies. It depends on the poem, because some of them are much more straightforward, I guess, to a certain extent. And some of them are much more embedded in the culture and history and the land. So it varies, but I think a check-in to see kind of, what they might be missing is, would ideally be part of the process for me.
We would like to ask you, would you consider further translation collaborations with a project such as ours?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. I mean, I think, like I was saying earlier, part of my work has been finding those spaces and those allies and those people that have a different understanding maybe of literature and oral tradition and so on than the mainstream in Canada. And so I'm always looking for, those collaborations, those allies, those new audiences who could gain something from the work, but also who can give back in a way that maybe Canadian audiences don't, for the most part. So having a different kind of relationship and dialogue with those audiences. To be honest, I haven't traveled to Mexico. I don't have a lot of knowledge. So that's something that I'm interested in. And I think, what I do know of Mexico, it's much more, I think, aware of, for good or bad, for better or worse, of the, Indigenous impact on people in Mexico than Canadians here, until recently, when people started assuming Indigenous identity in order to, get access to programs and so on, which is the problem we're having now, is a lot of people with no ancestry claiming to be Indigenous so that they can access programs that we fought for. But it's kind of a sidetrack. But I think, where there are places in the world where there's a high Indigenous population and influence, I'm always interested in that. I'm always interested in trying to create good relationships with people in those places and to find, other ways of supporting each other. Because there's an onslaught of European literatures and sometimes forcefully put upon us that we're constantly put in the position of having to react against. And so I think, maybe finding those homes where there's a different kind of understanding and a different way of working together is definitely something that I'm always interested in.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. That makes us all very happy. And the other thing is that, this interaction has been very interesting, because I think we can learn a lot about how to work better in future experiences. No, like we would love to continue working with your poems, and of course include you more in the process. No, I mean, this was the first time. It was sort of an experiment for everyone. So I think we can do a lot better in the future. No, so now that you've met our group of translators, we were hoping that you'd like to ask them a few questions regarding their process, perhaps, or I don't know. That's of course up to you, no? And then afterwards, well, hopefully you would like to read your poem and they can read their translation, so that in the end, the viewers will know what all of this discussion has been about, no, in a sense.
Okay. I do have a few questions, maybe fairly basic ones to start, because I don't really know very much about the process. I actually wasn't aware that there were so many people working on the translations. I didn't know that. So it's great to meet you. I'm curious about how you worked on it. Did you each do a translation? Did you work collaboratively on the translation? If someone could explain your various roles in this, I would be very interested.
Yes, it was a strange process for us too, because it was the first time we worked on a collective translation of something that it's such contained as a poem. So we kind of did an experiment on the process, and we discussed the different ways we could start working on it. But the first and foremost was reading the poem, analyzing it. We got together to talk about the poem. For example, we noticed this that Alejandra was mentioning at the beginning about not capitalizing the I and the lack of mostly punctuation and the musicality of the words. Also, this visual hummingbird that creates the lines, and we started talking about everything on the poem before getting to work with it, because we needed to acquire some kind of critical approach to it. And we also, of course, noticed this very sensuous, very erotic tone of the poem. So we had all of this in mind in order to create a certain purpose for the translation. And so we decided to get together and discuss, and then create a sort of draft, like an individual draft of every one of us. And then we got together to talk about our drafts. And then we discussed for hours and ended up creating a fifth final translation that is not exactly like bits and pieces of what we had, but something completely different and made out of the ideas of the four of us. But we also wanted to always to keep your voice there all the time, because this is something we had very clear since the beginning. We did not want to interfere with what the poem was doing. On the contrary, we wanted to highlight that on our language as much as we could. So yeah, Ale, I don't know if you want to add something.
Yes, well, I just think that one important part of the process was also to read it out loud, the final version, because we found that the orality of your poems is very important, and well, the fragmentation of each of the lines is what constructs the rhythm of the poem in general. So at the end, we read it out loud, each one of us, and every time it was different. So every time it was highlighted our own personal interpretation, but at the same time, it was a collective interpretation. So yes, we think that translation usually is an individual task, and it represents an individual interpretation. But in this case, each of the interpretations collectively constructed something new, which is, we cannot say which part is from what person. We just, it's from everybody.
Wow. That's amazing. I can't tell you how happy it makes me to hear that that's what the process was. I love the idea of, that you worked on it and then you came together and you created something new that you can't really delineate who contributed what parts to it. I just think, as a way of working, it just aligns so beautifully with, ideally what my work is trying to do, and Indigenous ways of thinking about consensus making and so on, that isn't valued very much or very often in Canadian society, but from what I've seen in, Western society in general. And so I'm so happy that you did it that way, and you came to something that was new. And I'm very, very happy that you read it out loud as you were working on it. That's fantastic. I'm always on my students about reading their own work out loud as they're editing and revising and composing it. And so to hear that you did that on the translation side of it makes me very, very happy, because I think so much of my work and the work of other Indigenous poets, and I'm sure some other poets as well, the sound and the rhythm and all of those things are so important, and you can't necessarily get that from the page. And now I'm feeling a tremendous amount of pressure about how I'm going to read this at the end of this, which will probably be, maybe not capturing the voices that you had in your minds when you were translating it, or even my own at this point. But yeah, I think it's such an important part of it. And I'm really happy that you replicated the kind of placement of the words and the lines on the page, which was done for various kinds of reasons, including the visuals, but also the spacing, and I try often in my poems to capture breath through spacing, to bring it into the page in a way. Although I don't know if readers necessarily get that intuitively, but I do. So I hope that others, get that when they're reading as well. So I'm very happy to hear about your process.
If there's anything else, sorry, if there's anything else you'd like to ask them, or?
I'm just wondering if, I guess, as you're going through it, if there were any questions that you had that you had those long conversations, but were there any that you weren't able to resolve, or that you were unsure of, or how you kind of, when difficult questions came up, how you worked to try to answer those questions?
Well, I think I can answer this one. We would really like to ask you, like, when we were translating, we wanted to know what the hummingbird meant, like, in your culture, if it had a specific meaning. And I don't know why, like, we didn't even thought, like, maybe we could write to Kateri and ask her, right? And it would be so much easier. But, well, for future times, we could do that, and it would be very enriching. But even though we knew the hummingbird probably doesn't mean the same, like in your context and in our context as a symbol, we could still relate, like, to the poem and recognize, well, all of the feelings describing it and how the hummingbird's actions relate to it. And we also thought it was a really transgressive poem, because for us, we don't usually associate, like, talking about pleasure and the feelings associated with pleasure with Indigenous writing. Like, traditionally, I don't think there is this association, at least in Mexico. So we thought it was really transgressive, and we wanted to respect, like, these transgressions and not take over them, but rather, like, establish a dialogue with them. So when we had these questions, we discussed them among each other, like, and each of us had a different interpretation, and it was really enriching to hear like all of our interpretations and to, I don't know, like to construct with each other the meaning or the possible meaning that we thought it was in the poem. I don't know if Eileen wants to add anything about this.
Yes. Personally, I established a deep connection with hummingbirds because when I read it, I was reminded of some of Natalia Toledo's poems. Toledo is a Zapotec poet who writes in Zapotec and Spanish, and she's also from my hometown, Juchitán, which is in the south of Oaxaca. And she writes a lot about our community. I have been working with some of her poems before I started translating hummingbirds, so I had all these images and information very fresh in my head. And when I first read hummingbirds, it immediately took me back to Toledo's poems. And given these associations, reading hummingbirds felt like a warm experience for me, and I really enjoyed it.
I'm sorry, what was that last thing you said?
That given the associations I saw with Toledo's poems, reading hummingbirds was a really warm experience for me, and I greatly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Sorry, I felt
easily distracted by the dog. Sorry.
I think that what Eileen was saying is that it sort of became personal in a different way, no?
A warm experience, I think, is what she said, no?
Yes. My dog is barking, sorry.
But by warm, you meant sensual, I suppose, sensory.
The dog is trying to get in on this conversation, which somehow seems fitting in its own way. Interesting. I guess I can respond to a couple of things. So the hummingbird in my culture is often seen as a kind of messenger, but a messenger of happiness and joy. So that's kind of the cultural context for it. But there also there's also just the traits of a hummingbird as well that bear on this poem as well, and the beauty of the hummingbird and the way that it moves, etc. So all of those aspects of it, I'm sure some of the things that you thought about hummingbirds are that's what hummingbirds are. That's what they're like. That's how they look. And it is transgressive, I suppose, and more so in some places than others. But if I could speak about Indigenous erotica for a moment, I'm always happy to do that. So yeah, this poem is part of a conscious effort on my part to not so much be transgressive, although it was, but to reclaim Indigenous sensuality, the erotic, sexuality, those kinds of, physical relationships between Indigenous people that so often in the media and literature and other forms of cultural transmission were so negative. At least here for a while, we heard a lot about residential school and the abuse and sexual abuse of our young, the children who were stolen from us and put into residential schools, and the harms that they suffered. And there was a lot of, disclosures around that in Canada. And so those kinds of stories were in the media a lot. And the other side of that we didn't hear about were all the loving relationships the kind of relationship like my grandparents had, of having these beautiful families and doing their best to raise their families despite all of those pressures from the effects of colonialism and so on. And so to me, to be accepting of the fully human, and we've been dehumanized so often, and Indigenous women have been dehumanized because we're not supposed to dress certain ways. We're not supposed to look certain ways, or we're asking for it. And asking for it, including getting murdered. This was a serious attempt to bring this back and to bring beauty into our relationships with each other, to bring joy into those relationships with each other. And so it's part of a larger project, if you can call it that, of mine, and working with other people and talking about it with other artists and writers. Was in Turtle Island in North America, or when I was traveling, when I was in Aotearoa or Hawaii or Australia, having those conversations with people about the importance of erotica. And it was transgressive. It was not something that people were talking about, even within our own communities. We bought into, many of us, into that kind of shame we've been taught, and we bought into those ideas around the erotic and our own bodies and our own lives. And so it was important, I think, to work to reclaim that. I'm really proud of my work in this area, because now Indigenous literatures in Canada, it's not a big deal to see that there are love poems, very sensual poems, that there are love scenes in our stories and in our storytelling, and it's taken a much more natural place within our literatures. Whereas before, I can remember saying the words Indigenous erotica at reading events and so on, and hearing an audible gasp, like, oh, like people did, like, what? They were much more comfortable if you said Indigenous protest literature, for example, than if you said Indigenous erotica. And so, that's part of it. And I'm really glad that you didn't shy away from that, even though, I'm not sure of the situation in Mexico and, and in your various backgrounds that you're coming from, but, and how transgressive that is. But certainly it was, and probably still is in some parts of Indigenous communities here as well. And at the time there were people who were very uncomfortable with it. So thank you for not shying away from that, or trying to, pretend it wasn't there in the way that it is.
Kalia, I don't know if you'd like to add something, or maybe Sophia, who's working on erotic literature and Indigenous poetry. I don't know if you'd like to ask something, Sophia. You do. So please go ahead.
Well, I just want to say hello, and it's very nice to see you talk in person, because I've been a big fan for a while, and I've especially of your work with Indigenous erotica, which is actually the theme for my thesis. Well, Desina, and well, I'm nervous now because I didn't think I was gonna get to talk, but I think it's really interesting the work you've been doing with erotica, and how long you've been doing it, and really inspiring, and I think very inspiring for others, and also I think relevant to the conversation about translation, because I've been reading a lot of your essay. Well, I don't know if you could call it an essay or manifesto on Without Reservations, Indigenous erotica style. No, erotica Indigenous style. I'm sorry, I got confused between the the collection and the the essay. But there's a section on it that you speak about how translation was used, especially in indigenous erotic stories, and how it was like used to take away these sort of erotic elements or to transform them and to transgress them. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how your relationship from your community and now with translation has been shaped, and your relationship with translation, if it has been like affected by sort of this past, and does it make you maybe doubt sometimes the type of translation that's being done in your own work, especially when your work deals with the same topics of erotica and how it is being translated into the West? Yes.
Yeah. Well, first, hi. Nice to meet you. Thank you. And thank you for studying my work. That's always so amazing to hear. So thanks for that. In terms of translation, yes. So what would happen in the past sometimes is that anthropologists would collect Indigenous stories and then they would reinterpret them so as to fit with two things: their perceptions of what these stories ought to be, based on their preconceived notions about various aspects of Indigenous people and culture and community. And then the audience that they were transcribing and transforming and translating them for. So one of the examples of that are the stories in Tales from the Smokehouse, which were collected by an anthropologist and reinterpreted. And I've heard, when I was a kid, my grandparents had a copy of that, and the illustrations by Daphne Ojig were very sexual and sensual, and done in a woodland style of art. And I was like fascinated, but I didn't really know what to make of this book because I was a kid, and you know, I thought it was weird that my grandparents even had it. You know, that it was kind of just there. My grandmother was a voracious reader, but it seemed like it was surprising that she had that book. But I was really interested in it. And years later, you know, especially when I was thinking about Indigenous erotica and the reclamation of that aspect of our stories and poetry, I thought about that collection. And I know that there were people later who said, you know, that they recognized the stories, but that's not the way that the stories would actually be told, that they'd been skewed and they'd been misinterpreted and they'd been changed in ways that they felt were not respectful to the spirit of the story. And, you know, so that was, I guess, a good lesson for me to understand. I'm not sure. I think I was as fascinated or more fascinated by the artwork though than the stories. So I'm not sure that there was the same kinds of criticism about the way that Daphne Ojig provided illustrations for the stories, but it did point to the ways that that our work can be, and our stories and important aspects of our culture can be taken and in a way used to serve the colonial project and not our own interests. And so I am aware of that. It's very fraught. It's very challenging because on the one hand, of course, you want your work to go out as widely as possible, and for people who might be interested in it to have access and to reach other people, and to try to communicate outside of, you know, your own territory or your own small areas of the world. But on the other hand, there's always that risk that, like I said before, that it's just superficial kind of literal translations, or, as you've mentioned, worse, that it's purposefully misinterpreted or reinterpreted, and that what you're trying to say is is, you know, disrespected and the voice, your voice is basically taken away from you in those situations. You're just, you know, I just don't know that. I don't know how you kind of accomplish both of those things. I don't know how you get those translations out there and you reach those audiences without trusting the translators to a certain extent. But I guess this conversation has taught me to a certain extent to be more forceful, I guess, and more to require more of a role in that process, so that I can mediate that as much as possible. Because honestly, it hasn't happened that much. So I haven't, you know, had much experience or knowledge of it, and haven't really taken much time to really think it through and think about, well, what can I do? What do I need to do? You know, how can I serve this story and this translation better? So it's been a really good learning experience for me as well to do that, and to try to take those fraught spaces and make them work in a way that is, you know, comfortable and productive for me and for the poem, or the stories, whatever. Yeah. So I guess it's kind of a partial answer to what you're asking, but I just haven't had a lot of time to kind of think it through. And I don't have enough experience with translation to really know whether one thing works better than something else. I just know that it's very fraught, and that it can be disempowering and damaging rather than a positive. And, you know, and that you have to try to negotiate and mediate and navigate all of that on, you know, hopefully on both sides, but especially, you know, on the creator or poet or writer side of things.
Claudia, you want to add something?
Just briefly before we tie up. Yes, it's that I think what Kateri has just said is sort of perfectly in harmony with our project. This idea that, okay, on the one hand, there's large publishing projects and ventures and plans, and that will continue. But on the other hand, if we can think of these sort of smaller projects in which we put texts and languages and cultures in dialogue, watching what happens. Okay, perhaps it won't be for a huge, vast audience, but it will mean a lot to smaller groups. And this always counts, no? It's perhaps one way of contributing to a better world. Also, the idea that from Mexico, putting in dialogue poems from other cultures, not just into Spanish, but adding an extra link into some Mexican indigenous languages and seeing what happens there, what are the doubts, what are the connections, where is there some sort of breach because the cultures differ enormously, no? I think we could keep on thinking about a lot of this, and also that when, and I don't know, Kateri, your publishing house, but increasingly we were brought up in university told that no good translator could ever use a footnote or a prologue. That was forbidden. And increasingly we are starting to disobey this. We do need footnotes, we do need prologues to explain, to tell, to show, and to make the reading process much more meaningful. So I've thought this great. I've learned a lot. There's so much I feel we can do. So thank you. And Ariadna is in charge again. And that's it for now. Thank you.
I'd just like to add to what Claudia is saying, that in our translation classes, we usually try to emphasize how translation is never neutral. No, that this is it's completely false. It's a fallacy to believe that translation can be neutral, or that there aren't a lot of power relations at play. So this is something that we we encourage our students to be constantly aware of. No, that they should keep in mind, for instance, this kind of collective project goes against this conventional idea that translation is a solitary act, or that it's the interpretation of a single person, and that person has the authority to take all the decisions. No, so we try to discuss how, because translation has been historically used both for good things and for very, very bad things. No, how to use translation as a way of empowering themselves, empowering the text and the authors. No. So anyway, I just wanted to make this brief comment to sort of wrap up what the sort of the spirit of this project is. And well, finally, if you all agree, we'd love to hear you, Kateri, reading your poem, and then our translator's version, so we can finish with this happy note.
Okay. Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you for all of that. And thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this amazing discussion. I've really enjoyed it and gotten a lot from it, a lot of food for thought. Okay, so I'll read from the version of my poem that you provided back to me. Okay. Hummingbirds. I am a hummingbird darting into luscious wetness, your dulcet tongue spilling nectar, while a brilliant flower sprouts in thick, damp moss. Then my heart becomes hummingbird's wings as I hover above you, hungering for the honeysuckle taste of you. And now you are my hummingbird, pushing a hard, thick tongue into the unfolding petals of my succulent flower. And now I would love to hear the translations. Miigwech.
Yes, that was amazing. We decided to read the translation together since this was our collaborative project. So I will begin. Colibríes. Soy colibrí, abalanzándome hacia exquisita humedad.
Tu lengua dulzona derrama néctar, mientras la flor radiante retoña en espeso musgo acuoso.
Entonces mi corazón se torna alas de colibrí, mientras revoloteo sobre ti.
Con hambre de tu sabor, madreselva, te sorbo.
Y ahora tú eres mi colibrí.
Empujando una firme lengua gruesa
hacia el desplegar de los pétalos
de mi suculenta flor.
Nice, thank you. Wonderful.
Yes, that was really good. It went out very good. Okay, well, so thank you very much again, everyone. Kateri, Claudia, of course, for organizing this, and Jimena, and for, well, the translators as well. No, so I don't know if you'd like to say some closing remarks, Claudia or Kateri.
I'd just like to say thank you once again for accepting, Kateri, because not everybody has been willing to sort of approach us and show interest in our project. We'd very much like to keep in touch with you, tell you about future plans and see if there's something we could sort of keep on doing together, perhaps something in person here in Mexico next year. In the meantime, yes, I'm very proud also de mis chicas de la UNAM. I thank the UNAM for all the support. Oscar Vadillo, who saw to all the technical part. Ariadna for chairing this. And once again, there's nothing like working collectively. It's, again, very strict academia does not like this. You can't have sometimes more than one name sort of for the project or for something, and that's not true. No, this functions because we're all in it together. So thank you, everybody. And Kateri, it's been, you've made this a great moment for us all. Thank you.
Oh, Miigwech, thank you so much. Thank you for including me. And I'm really fascinated by the project that you're doing. It's really gratifying to meet a group like you that is working collectively and that cares so much about trying to answer some of these questions that we've been talking about today. So thank you so much for taking an interest in my work and for including me in this. It's been wonderful and very thought-provoking. Miigwech, thank you.